Hello and welcome to Digital Environment Painting. I am Noah Bradley and let's get right to the painting. Here you can see the rough sketch that I started out with. It's very rough, but since there's not really any architecture or complicated perspective going on in the scene, I didn't really have any need to tighten up and do a really refined drawing. Here I'm starting the block in of the scene underneath the line drawing that I had. I'm trying to get the overall lighting and colors and values of the scene established really early on. I'm not going in and detailing and using a small brush to really figure out things. I'm just using big brushes and big general marks to imply what's going to be happening. I think going in too soon with a small brush and detailing and rendering will just get you in a lot of trouble, unless you're really good and really know what you're doing. And I really don't. So I start out big and try to get the general impression to read. You'll notice in the upper right I've got the little navigator thing in Photoshop so that I can always see a little thumbnail of how my image looks without having to zoom out and zoom in and all that. I think having that up there really helps me. I would highly recommend it because once my image reads in that little thumbnail, I know I've got a strong image. One thing you may notice that I've been doing a lot is flipping my image. I've even got it set to a keyboard shortcut in Photoshop. It's a lot like using a mirror in traditional painting. It gives you a fresh look at your composition, at your colors, and sometimes it's just easier to work on it flipped. It's really one of my favorite things about digital painting. I like to stay zoomed out in the painting as long as possible. It'll help me to pay attention to the whole picture and not get caught up in detailing. Details are something beginners like to think is what painting is all about. They get all concerned with rendering and techniques and forget really what painting's about, which is the whole picture. If you can establish a good solid thumbnail, then really the painting process just comes with time and practice. Rendering things is not nearly as important, at least in my opinion, as establishing a good, strong composition. I've been asked a lot of times how I figure out lighting in a scene. Since I'm not really using much reference here, and I'm not painting, of course, from a real life subject, how do I figure out how the lighting works? And there's a lot to think about, but one good general rule to start off with is keep your lights warm and your shadows cool, or your lights cool and your shadows warm. Getting that general scheme down will help immensely. But even more important is establishing a good value separation, separating your lights from your darks and keeping them very separate. I think it was Howard Pyle that said that the lightest part of your darks should never be as light as the darkest part of your lights. That might seem complicated, but essentially you want your value range from your lights completely separated from the value range from your darks. Doing this will really clarify your images and avoid muddiness both in the shadows and in the lights. You can see right now I'm starting to paint on top of the line drawing. Once I get to a certain point and have generally established things and I'm comfortable with losing the line drawing, I'll start to paint on top. Typically when I do this, I will shift copy the whole image and put it onto a new layer. That tends to be how I go about my whole images as far as layers go. I'm not very good with layer management. I just can't keep it all straight in my head, so I prefer to just work on a single layer, and incrementally I'll just shift copy the whole thing and put it on a new layer. There's several advantages to doing this. For one thing, the smudge tool really works best if you're working on a single layer. For another thing, you'll see later in the image, I'll turn the top layer on and off and be able to see my progress on what I've been doing lately to make sure I'm going in the right direction and not losing any important things that I had done before. Right about this time, I'm starting to get happy with the image. It's not to say I would call this a finished image, but then again, if I was doing like a speed painting or something, I might call it finished. Sometimes I'm a little lazy. But the main thing I'm seeing right now is that the image reads as a whole. I think the lighting effect is working and the overall colors are working, and I kind of like the image. And from here on out, it's really just detailing and painting and figuring out the small nuances of the image. You'll notice I'll probably start zooming in a few minutes. But already in painting time, I mean, I had only been painting for 25 minutes at this point, and I've got a solid image that reads as a whole. In fact, I'd say that's almost a good exercise is to do some speed painting. Try to establish a good solid image overall fairly quickly. Practicing doing that will give you a whole new appreciation for developing the whole image. I did speed paintings for quite a while, and really that's how I developed a lot of my environment and landscape painting skills. So if you're really interested in doing some of this landscape or environment painting, I would say do speed painting every day or every other day. They don't have to take very long. That's why they're called speed paintings. Probably the longest ones I used to do were, I don't know, maybe an hour and a half. Some of the shortest ones I had got done in like 20 minutes. It'll teach you to be really efficient with your techniques, to try to get a good texture in your landscapes so that you don't have to actually paint the details themselves. You'll learn to imply things rather than rendering things, which is essential in doing landscapes. Now, if you're not comfortable working in color for these speed paintings, it's a really good exercise to just work in black and white. When I think back, some of my first speed paintings were in just grayscale, and you can learn a lot doing it just with value. So my challenge to all of you is to start doing some speed painting. And if you want to show me your results, I'd be happy to take a look, maybe even comment on them, unless I'm swarmed with thousands of replies. But somehow I don't think that's going to happen. So yeah, get in touch and I'll be happy to critique you and maybe even give you some useful advice. But I wouldn't count on that. I want to reiterate that I'm still staying zoomed out here. Even though I'm 35 minutes into the painting, I'm not zooming in, not worrying about the details. Some people will ask, well, what should I work on if I'm going to be working on the whole image? And the idea that I've always liked, and I don't even know who first said this, was that you pick whatever you hate the most in your image and work on that. And then once you get that fixed, you pick the next thing that you hate the most in your image and work on that. And if you keep doing that for long enough, you'll probably end up with a decent image. Since I know somebody's eventually going to ask this, what brushes do I use? I'm just going to tell you right now that it really doesn't matter that much. Yes, I do use some custom brushes here. A lot of them I've found from other sources and downloaded them. A couple of them I made myself, but I'm not terribly good at making brushes. But really, brushes don't matter that much. They're kind of handy for speed painting because you can imply things a little faster and get away from that overly digital look a little easier. But really, the hard round brush that Photoshop comes with has done so many amazing paintings that that should be proof enough that you don't need a fancy brush to do good paintings. Now, I mentioned speed painting as a way for me to learn environment painting. And it's true, I did a lot of them and learned so much from them, and I would recommend everyone to try it out. But the thing that helped me a lot more than that is real landscape painting. I got outside, brought my paints, and went into the scenery and did some real live plein air painting. Doing this will teach you so much about environments and landscapes. There's a certain naturalness that you'll get if you're painting from life that you can't get anywhere else. And getting out there and really experiencing the landscape and trying to capture it is an experience like nothing else. It's also really fun, and so I would really recommend it. Even if you live in the city, it's probably not quite as ideal for a natural landscape, but you can still learn a lot about the way light falls on objects and the colors that you'll see in nature that will help your painting so much. Even if you don't want to do landscapes, they'll still help you. So get out there and do some awesome landscape paintings. But even when you're not out there doing those landscape paintings, you can still improve your skills just going about your daily lives by observing the world around you. It's so important, and I really can't stress it enough. I am constantly observing the world around me. I will be driving my car, and sure, I'll pay a little attention to the road, but mostly I'm looking around and seeing the colors, the trees and the leaves, and seeing how the shadows are cast across the road and the color of the light, and how all of this interacts with each other, the reflected light, and I'm trying to constantly pay attention so that when I do go and try to make up a landscape like I'm doing now, I'll have that information in the back of my head to pull from so that even without looking up any reference images, I have something from life to pull from. And since I've got that something to pull from, my images will be much more believable. And especially when you're working in fantasy or science fiction imagery, selling a believable image is so critical. Since the landscapes in fantasy and science fiction are so, well, fantastical, grounding it in nature and grounding it in natural lighting and natural scenery really helps the viewer accept the reality that you've created. So beyond speed painting, beyond doing landscape painting from life, and beyond just observing the world around you, another thing that I'd really recommend people to do is to look up the old masters of landscape painting or really any painting. You'll learn so much from the people who have already done it really well that it'll save you so much trouble. Seeing how a great artist pulled off a really dramatic lighting scheme will save you the trouble of figuring how to do that yourself. And if you're stuck on names and need a few places to start looking at great paintings, I would recommend Albert Bierstadt as an excellent example of landscape painting. He is a phenomenal American landscape painter. Some of my other favorites for lighting would be Caravaggio, the classic. Sargent is phenomenal for so many reasons. Rembrandt, mainly portraiture, but at the same time, his lighting is so soft and subtle that it's just really gorgeous. And you can apply the same things no matter whether you're painting a portrait or a landscape. So it really carries over. George Enos is another of my favorites. He is beautifully subtle and really holds his values back until he really needs them. And he'll have that one place in his painting that really pops, and they're just astonishing paintings. Thomas Moran is another of my favorites, and speaking of which, really the whole Hudson River School is a great place to check out beautiful landscapes. You can learn so much just from that one school and just from that one time period. You can find images of all of these artists online, but I would really recommend getting to a museum and checking out the real ones. Computers do not have the range of colors that a real oil painting has. Now, I mentioned earlier that I like to use the smudge tool. You'll probably see me use it in a little bit, but it's something that I'm really hesitant to advise any beginner to use because it's kind of like the soft airbrush in that beginners will tend to abuse it and end up with a really ugly image. I'd almost advise that if you're just starting out and you don't really know what you're doing, to not ever use the smudge tool. It'll teach you to be more confident with your brushstrokes. But if you are to the point where you're a little more confident, I'd give it a try. I avoided it because I thought it was kind of evil. It was one of those tools that you're not supposed to use. And then I realized it was really, really useful because it makes it easier for me to adjust my edges. And soft and hard edges will help so much in conveying depth, conveying form, and just interest in the variety of edges.